The story of Sylvia Likens is one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking cases of child abuse and murder in American history. Sylvia was a 16-year-old girl who was tortured to death over the course of several months by Gertrude Baniszewski, her children, and local neighborhood kids. The abuse she suffered was so horrific that it continues to shock and haunt people to this day. This case stands as a horrifying reminder of the cruelty that human beings can inflict on others, particularly when society fails to intervene. Background: Sylvia Likens was born on January 3, 1949, to working-class parents Lester and Betty Likens. She had 4 siblings, including her younger sister Jenny, who had a disability due to polio. The Likens family struggled financially as Lester and Betty worked as carnival workers, often traveling to make ends meet. Because of their nomadic lifestyle, Sylvia and Jenny were frequently left in the care of relatives or family friends. In the summer of 1965, Sylvia and Jenny were placed in the care of Gertrude Baniszewski, a single mother of 7 children, while their parents traveled for work. Gertrude agreed to take care of the girls for $20 a week. Initially, the arrangement seemed to work out, but when payments began arriving late, Gertrude's frustration turned into something far darker. The abuse begins. What started as small acts of verbal abuse soon escalated into horrific physical violence. Gertrude began taking her anger out on Sylvia, accusing her of being dirty, promiscuous, and a thief. Sylvia became the scapegoat for Gertrude's growing financial and personal frustrations, while Jenny was largely spared from the abuse due to her disability. The abuse quickly worsened. Gertrude beat Sylvia with belts, sometimes forcing her own children to participate. Her eldest daughter, Paula Baniszewski, would frequently punch and slap Sylvia, often in the face, causing visible swelling and bruising. Paula, who was pregnant at the time, was encouraged by her mother to vent her frustration on Sylvia. Gertrude also spread lies about Sylvia, accusing her of spreading rumors and being sexually active, none of which were true. These false accusations were used as justification for the continued abuse, and soon the other children, including neighborhood kids, were invited to take part. Escalation of torture. The abuse turned into a sadistic daily routine. Sylvia was denied food, and when she did eat, Gertrude would often force her to eat spoiled or rotten food. If Sylvia complained or tried to find food on her own, she would be further punished. On one occasion, Gertrude caught Sylvia eating and forced her to eat her own vomit as punishment. At the encouragement of Gertrude, Sylvia was subjected to increasingly humiliating and painful forms of torture. She was forced to strip naked in front of the other children, and Gertrude made Sylvia perform degrading acts while they watched. The group began to burn Sylvia with cigarettes, leaving scars and burns all over her body. It's estimated that over 100 cigarette burns were inflicted on her during her captivity. The abuse wasn't limited to Gertrude and her children. Local neighborhood boys, including Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard, were also invited to the house to beat and torture Sylvia. They took part in slapping her, kicking her, and burning her with cigarettes, treating the abuse as a twisted form of entertainment. Imprisonment in the basement. As the abuse escalated, Sylvia's health began to deteriorate. She became severely malnourished, weak, and unable to defend herself against the daily beatings. Gertrude began locking Sylvia in the cold, damp basement, where she was often tied up and left alone for long periods of time. She was denied access to the bathroom and was forced to relieve herself in the basement. Gertrude would often go down to the basement with her children to beat Sylvia or throw her down the stairs. The basement became Sylvia's prison, and her body began to break down under the constant abuse. She was covered in bruises, burns, and sores, and her physical condition worsened by the day. Carving and final torture. In one of the most horrific acts of the entire ordeal, Gertrude decided to permanently mark Sylvia. She forced Richard Hobbs to carve the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," into Sylvia's abdomen using a heated needle. Sylvia, too weak to resist, endured this torture while the children looked on and laughed. The sadistic pleasure that Gertrude and the children took in Sylvia's suffering is one of the most chilling aspects of this case. Despite her severe injuries and weakened state, the torture continued. Sylvia was burned with hot metal objects, beaten with a curtain rod, and starved. She was forced to crawl across the floor and made to repeat degrading phrases about herself. By this point, Sylvia was too weak to walk or even speak properly. On October 25, 1965, after attempting to escape the basement, Sylvia was beaten so severely that she could no longer move. The final act of cruelty came when Gertrude forced Sylvia to write a letter, falsely claiming that she had run away and encountered a gang of boys who abused her. This letter was part of Gertrude's plan to cover up the abuse and shift the blame elsewhere. Sylvia Likens' death. The following day, on October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens succumbed to the abuse. She died from brain swelling, internal hemorrhaging, and shock caused by the prolonged, brutal torture. Sylvia's emaciated body was discovered in the filthy basement, covered in burns, bruises, and other injuries. She had endured months of unspeakable suffering. After Sylvia's death, Gertrude attempted to cover up the crime, but Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, told a neighbor what had happened. The police were called, and when they arrived, they were horrified by the scene inside the Baniszewski home. The trial and convictions. The trial of Gertrude Baniszewski, along with her children and several neighborhood kids, shocked the nation as the horrific details of Sylvia Likens' abuse and murder came to light. The case captured national attention due to the extreme brutality Sylvia suffered and the fact that multiple people, including children, participated in her torture over several months. Baniszewski was charged with first-degree murder, and the trial revealed the horrific extent of her sadistic control over the others involved. Her daughter, Paula Baniszewski, along with John Baniszewski Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard, were also charged with Sylvia's murder. During the trial, Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, who had also been living in the Baniszewski household, testified against Gertrude and detailed the horrific abuse Sylvia endured. Jenny's testimony, along with the overwhelming evidence of Sylvia's injuries, left the jury horrified by the cruelty Sylvia experienced. Gertrude Baniszewski was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Paula Baniszewski was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life as well. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Baniszewski Jr. were convicted of manslaughter, receiving lesser sentences for their roles in Sylvia's death. However, the sentences were not without controversy. Gertrude, despite being sentenced to life, was released on parole after serving just 20 years. Many felt that justice was not fully served, given the severity of her crime. Several others involved in Sylvia's torture received relatively light sentences and were released early, which sparked outrage in the community. The trial highlighted the brutal, systematic abuse that Sylvia Likens suffered, and the verdict, though resulting in some convictions, left a lingering sense of injustice for many who believed the punishments did not match the severity of the crime.